The morning whistle pierced through the grey dawn of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1885, summoning hundreds of workers to another grueling day at the Pennsylvania Steel Railway Company. Black smoke billowed from the towering smokestacks, casting shadows over the ramshackle company, housing where families crowded into single rooms, their lives dictated by the rhythm of industrial progress. Samuel Morrison stood at the window of his opulent mansion overlooking the sprawling rail yard, watching the ant-like figures of his workforce shuffle toward the massive locomotive construction facility. At 52, Morrison had built his empire through ruthless efficiency and an iron will that brooked no dissent. The Pennsylvania Steel Railway Company was his crown jewel, producing locomotives that carried America's dreams of westward expansion on ribbons of steel. Down in the yard, 23-year-old Thomas McKenna wiped the grease from his calloused hands as he prepared for another 16-hour shift. The son of Irish immigrants, Thomas had worked in Morrison's factories since he was 14, learning the intricate mechanics of steam engines and railroad construction. His keen mind and natural aptitude for machinery had earned him respect among his fellow workers, though not the attention of management who saw labourers as replaceable parts in their grand machine. The factory floor buzzed with the deafening clang of hammers on steel, the hiss of steam, and the constant rumble of heavy machinery. Workers moved like clockwork, their movements precise but weary from years of repetitive labour. The air was thick with coal dust and metal shavings, a toxic fog that claimed the lungs of many who dared to breathe it for too long. Morrison's foreman, Chester Aldrich, prowled the factory floor with a pocket watch in one hand and a clipboard in the other. A thin, wiry man with sharp features and cold grey eyes, Aldrich had earned his position through unwavering loyalty to Morrison's vision of maximum production at minimum cost. He stopped beside a group of workers struggling to lift a massive boiler section into place. "Move faster, you lazy dogs," Aldrich barked, his voice cutting through the industrial cacophony. "Mr. Morrison doesn't pay you to take your time. We've got 3 locomotives to finish by month's end, and every minute you waste costs this company money." The workers strained against the weight, their faces red with exertion. One older man, his hair grey with age and coal dust, stumbled slightly under the burden. Aldrich immediately noticed the slight falter in rhythm. "O'Brien, you're slowing down the line," Aldrich snapped. "Either keep up or find yourself replaced by someone who can handle honest work." Patrick O'Brien, a 20-year veteran of the factory, gritted his teeth and adjusted his grip on the heavy metal. At 55, his body bore the accumulated damage of decades in Morrison's employ, but he needed the meagre wages to support his wife and 3 children. Like many of his fellow workers, O'Brien had no choice but to endure whatever conditions Morrison and his management imposed. Thomas observed the exchange from his position at a nearby workstation where he was calibrating pressure gauges for a new locomotive engine. He had witnessed countless such incidents over the years, watching good men broken down by the relentless demands of industrial production. The company paid workers barely enough to survive, charged them rent for substandard housing, and demanded loyalty while showing none in return. As the day wore on, the temperature in the factory climbed steadily. The massive furnaces used for forging steel components turned the workspace into a sweltering inferno. But Morrison had long ago determined that installing adequate ventilation would be an unnecessary expense. Workers collapsed regularly from heat exhaustion, only to be dragged aside and replaced by the next desperate soul seeking employment. During the brief lunch break, Thomas sat with his fellow workers in the shade of a massive locomotive under construction. The men shared meagre meals of bread and thin soup, discussing in hushed tones the rumours circulating about wage cuts and longer working hours. Morrison's profits had soared as railroad construction boomed across the expanding nation, but none of that prosperity trickled down to the men whose labour made it all possible. "I heard Morrison bought himself another mansion in Philadelphia," muttered James Sullivan, a boilermaker with arms like tree trunks. "Meanwhile, my youngest daughter's been coughing up blood from the coal smoke, and I can't afford to see a doctor." The conversation was interrupted by Aldrich's shrill whistle, summoning them back to work. As the workers reluctantly returned to their stations, Thomas noticed Morrison himself descending from his office overlooking the factory floor. Dressed in an expensive suit and carrying a gold-headed walking stick, the railroad magnate moved through his domain like a king surveying his subjects. Morrison's presence always created a tension that rippled through the workforce. He rarely ventured onto the factory floor, preferring to observe from his elevated office where he could monitor productivity without breathing the poisoned air his workers endured daily. When he did appear, it usually meant changes were coming, and those changes rarely benefited the laborers who generated his wealth. Morrison's polished boots clicked against the factory floor as he made his way through the maze of machinery and sweating workers. His cold blue eyes surveyed the operation with the calculating gaze of a man who saw human beings as mere components in his industrial machine. Behind him trailed his personal secretary, Harold Pemberton, a nervous young man with wire-rimmed spectacles who frantically scribbled notes as Morrison barked observations and commands. "Production is down 3% from last month," Morrison declared, his voice carrying over the din of hammering and steam. "I want to know why my investment isn't generating the returns I expect. These men are paid to work, not to dawdle about like schoolchildren." Thomas kept his head down as the railroad baron passed his workstation, but his ears caught every word. He had been tracking production numbers in his head for months, and he knew the decrease wasn't due to worker laziness. The machinery was aging, breaking down more frequently, and Morrison refused to invest in proper maintenance or replacement parts. Instead, he demanded workers compensate for mechanical failures through longer hours and more intense labor. At the locomotive assembly station, Morrison stopped to observe a team of workers struggling with a massive drive wheel assembly. The hoist system, a contraption of pulleys and chains installed years ago, groaned ominously under the weight. Thomas had reported the deteriorating condition of the equipment to Aldrich weeks ago, but his concerns had been dismissed as the complaints of a troublemaker. "This operation should take half the time," Morrison snapped to Aldrich. "Why are these men moving like they're walking through molasses?" Aldrich shifted uncomfortably, knowing full well that the workers were doing everything humanly possible with the inadequate equipment provided. "Sir, the men are working as fast as safety allows. Perhaps if we could invest in some newer hoisting equipment." Morrison's eyes flashed with anger. "I don't pay you to make excuses, Aldrich. I pay you to get results. If these men can't handle the work with the tools provided, then perhaps they're not the right men for the job." As if summoned by Morrison's words, disaster struck. The ancient hoist chain, stressed beyond its capacity, snapped with a metallic crack that echoed through the factory. The massive drive wheel plummeted toward the ground, and workers scattered in panic. Patrick O'Brien, still weakened from the morning's exertion, stumbled as he tried to dive clear. The wheel crashed down, pinning his leg beneath tons of forged steel. O'Brien's scream pierced through the factory noise, bringing all work to a sudden halt. Workers rushed to his aid, straining to lift the enormous wheel while others called for help. Blood pooled beneath the trapped man as he writhed in agony, his leg clearly crushed beyond repair. Thomas immediately abandoned his workstation and rushed to O'Brien's side. His mechanical knowledge told him they needed leverage to lift the wheel safely without causing further injury. "Get me a long iron bar and something to use as a fulcrum," he shouted to nearby workers. "We need to create a lever system." While workers scrambled to find the necessary tools, Thomas knelt beside O'Brien, trying to keep the injured man conscious and calm. "Stay with me, Patrick. We're going to get you out of there." Morrison observed the scene with cold detachment, showing no sign of concern for his injured employee. "How long is this going to take?" he demanded. "I have a production schedule to maintain, and this delay is costing me money." Thomas looked up at Morrison in disbelief. A man was dying, possibly losing his leg, and the railroad baron's only concern was his profit margin. "Sir, we need to get Mr. O'Brien to a doctor immediately. This is a serious injury that requires proper medical attention." "That's not my concern," Morrison replied curtly. "O'Brien knew the risks when he took this job. If he can't handle the work, he shouldn't have applied for the position. Get him out of here and back to production." The callousness of Morrison's response ignited something in Thomas that had been smouldering for years. He stood up slowly, his hands still stained with O'Brien's blood, and faced the man who held the lives of hundreds in his grip. "With respect, sir, this accident happened because you refused to maintain proper equipment. That hoist chain was ready to break weeks ago." A dangerous silence fell over the immediate area as workers turned to witness the unprecedented confrontation. No one had ever dared to challenge Morrison so directly, especially not a common labourer. Morrison's face darkened with rage, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his walking stick. "Are you questioning my judgment, boy?" Morrison's voice was low and threatening. "Do you think you understand the complexities of running a business better than I do?" Thomas felt the weight of every worker's gaze upon him. He knew that his next words could cost him his job, possibly his life in this unforgiving industrial landscape. But looking down at Patrick O'Brien's broken body, he realized that some things were worth more than the security of employment under a tyrant. "I'm saying that good men are getting hurt because you value money more than human lives," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "We've been telling you about safety problems for months, and you've ignored every warning. This didn't have to happen." The factory had gone completely quiet now, even the machinery seeming to pause in anticipation of Morrison's response. The railroad baron's face had turned purple with rage, and his hands trembled with barely contained fury. Morrison's walking stick crashed down on a nearby workbench with such force that the sound reverberated through the factory like a gunshot. His face contorted with rage, veins bulging on his forehead as he stepped closer to Thomas, using his height and position to intimidate the young mechanic. "How dare you speak to me that way?" Morrison seethed, his voice rising to a roar that could be heard over the distant machinery still running in other sections of the factory. "I built this company from nothing. I created jobs for worthless immigrants and ungrateful laborers who should be thanking me for the privilege of employment." Thomas stood his ground, though every instinct told him to back down. Around them, workers continued their desperate efforts to free Patrick O'Brien, who had fallen unconscious from pain and blood loss. The contrast between Morrison's selfish fury and O'Brien's suffering only strengthened Thomas's resolve. "Mr. Morrison, a man is dying," Thomas said firmly. "We can discuss business matters after we get him proper medical care. Every minute we delay could cost him his leg, or his life." Morrison's eyes blazed with an intensity that seemed almost inhuman. He had built his empire by crushing anyone who dared to question his authority, and he would not tolerate insubordination from a common laborer. "You think you can lecture me about my own business? You think some Irish drunk is worth more than the productivity of this entire operation?" The cruel words hung in the air like poison. Several Irish workers in the vicinity tensed at the ethnic slur, their faces hardening with anger. Thomas felt the collective rage of his fellow labourers, but he also sensed their fear. Morrison held their livelihoods in his hands, and challenging him meant risking not just their own welfare, but that of their families. Aldrich, sensing the dangerous escalation of the confrontation, stepped forward nervously. "Sir, perhaps we should focus on clearing the accident scene and resuming production. I can handle disciplinary matters with McKenna later." Morrison whirled on his foreman with equal fury. "Okay. Don't tell me how to handle my employees, Aldrich. This boy needs to learn his place, and everyone in this factory needs to see what happens to workers who forget who signs their paychecks." By now, workers from other sections had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion and the unprecedented sight of someone standing up to Morrison. They formed a loose circle around the confrontation, their faces showing a mixture of admiration for Thomas's courage and terror at what Morrison might do in response. Morrison noticed the growing crowd and saw an opportunity to make an example that would crush any future rebellion before it could take root. He raised his walking stick and pointed it directly at Thomas's chest. "You're finished, McKenna. Not only are you fired, but I'll make sure you never work in any factory, mill, or construction site from here to California. I have connections throughout this industry, and one word from me will make you unemployable." The threat struck Thomas like a physical blow. In 1885, industrial jobs were scarce, and Morrison's influence extended far beyond Pittsburgh. Being blacklisted by such a powerful man could mean poverty and starvation for Thomas and any family he might hope to have. But as he looked at Patrick O'Brien's pale face and saw the fear in his co-worker's eyes, he realized that some fights were worth the cost. "Then so be it," Thomas replied quietly. "But before you destroy my life, at least let us save his." Morrison's fury reached a crescendo. He had expected Thomas to beg for forgiveness, to grovel and plead for his job like so many others had done before. The young man's continued defiance in the face of such devastating consequences was incomprehensible to someone who had always been able to buy or intimidate his way out of any conflict. "Get him out of my sight," Morrison bellowed to Aldrich. "I want him off company property immediately, and anyone who helps him or shows him any sympathy will join him on the street. I won't tolerate rebellion in my factory." But something unexpected began to happen. James Sullivan, the massive boilermaker, stepped forward from the crowd of workers. His jaw was set with determination, and his powerful hands were clenched into fists. "Mr. Morrison, Thomas McKenna is the finest mechanic in this factory. If he goes, you'll lose more than just one worker." Morrison turned his venomous gaze on Sullivan. "Are you threatening me, Sullivan? Because I can replace you just as easily as I can replace him." More workers began to step forward, forming a protective circle around Thomas. They were men who had endured years of abuse, degradation, and dangerous working conditions. They had watched friends and colleagues injured or killed by Morrison's cost-cutting measures. For the first time, they had someone willing to voice their collective suffering. "We all know the equipment is dangerous," called out another worker. "We all know men have died because you won't spend money on safety." "Thomas speaks for all of us," added a third voice from the crowd. Morrison looked around at the sea of hostile faces surrounding him and felt something he had not experienced in years: genuine fear. His wealth and power meant nothing if his entire workforce turned against him. But his pride and arrogance would not allow him to back down or show any sign of weakness. "Fine," Morrison snarled, his voice dripping with malice. "If you want to support this troublemaker, then you can all suffer the consequences. Anyone who doesn't return to work immediately will be fired. I'll bring in new workers from New York, men who understand the value of steady employment and know how to show proper respect." The standoff continued as workers weighed their options. They had families to feed, rent to pay, and nowhere else to turn for employment. But they also had their dignity, and for the first time in years, they had hope that things might change. The tension in the factory reached a breaking point as workers faced an impossible choice between solidarity and survival. Morrison stood in the center of the crowd, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the grimy work clothes surrounding him, waiting for his ultimatum to break their resolve. But instead of the expected retreat, something unprecedented began to unfold. James Sullivan took another step forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over Morrison. "You want to fire us all, Mr. Morrison? Go ahead. But who's going to build your locomotives? Who's going to operate the furnaces and work the steel? You can't run this factory without us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered workers. For years they had been told they were replaceable, expendable parts in Morrison's industrial machine. But Thomas's courage had reminded them of a fundamental truth. Their labor was the source of Morrison's wealth, and without them, his empire was nothing but empty buildings and idle machinery. Meanwhile, Patrick O'Brien's condition was deteriorating. Thomas had managed to organize a makeshift rescue effort, using iron bars as levers, and several workers had finally lifted the massive drive wheel enough to pull the injured man free. His leg was mangled beyond recognition, blood soaking through improvised bandages made from torn clothing. "He needs a doctor now," Thomas declared, cradling O'Brien's head. "Every second we delay increases the risk he'll lose the leg or bleed to death." Morrison glanced dismissively at the injured worker. "Company policy is clear. Medical expenses for workplace injuries are the responsibility of the employee. If O'Brien wants medical care, he can pay for it himself." The callousness of this statement sent a fresh wave of anger through the crowd. Many of these men had seen friends and colleagues suffer similar fates, left to die or live as cripples because they couldn't afford proper medical treatment. Morrison's wealth could easily cover the cost of saving O'Brien's life, but his greed was more important than human compassion. Thomas carefully transferred O'Brien to the arms of two strong workers. "Take him to Dr. Henderson on 5th Street. Tell the doctor I'll personally guarantee payment for his treatment." It was a promise Thomas couldn't afford to keep, but he would find a way to honor it rather than let a good man suffer. Morrison laughed harshly. "You'll guarantee payment? You don't have a job, McKenna. You don't even have a future in this industry. What could you possibly offer as collateral for medical bills?" "More than you might think," Thomas replied, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "I may not have your money, Mr. Morrison, but I have something you can't buy: the respect and trust of these workers. And right now, that's worth more than all your wealth." As O'Brien was carefully carried toward the factory exit, Thomas turned to address the crowd of workers. He had never seen himself as a leader, but circumstances had thrust him into a role that could change everything for the laborers of the Pennsylvania Steel Railway Company. "Listen to me," Thomas called out, his voice carrying across the silent factory floor. "Mr. Morrison thinks we're nothing without him, but he's wrong. We built this company with our hands, our sweat, and our blood. Every locomotive that leaves this factory exists because of our skill and dedication. We have the power to demand fair treatment, safe working conditions, and decent wages." Morrison's face turned an even deeper shade of purple. You're talking about forming a union, aren't you? I'll crush any attempt at organized labor before it can take root. I have connections in the government, the police, and the courts. I can make your lives miserable in ways you can't imagine. But Thomas was no longer intimidated by Morrison's threats. The support of his fellow workers had given him strength he didn't know he possessed. Maybe you can destroy me, Mr. Morrison, but can you destroy all of us? Can you replace every skilled mechanic, every experienced steelworker, every man who knows how to operate your machinery? Around the factory, workers began to nod and voice their agreement. They had endured Morrison's tyranny for too long, sacrificing their health, their safety, and their dignity for wages that barely kept their families fed. Thomas's rebellion had shown them that resistance was possible, that they didn't have to accept whatever conditions Morrison imposed. Sullivan stepped beside Thomas, his massive presence a physical symbol of worker solidarity. McKenna's right, we've been afraid for too long, letting Morrison treat us like animals because we thought we had no choice. But we do have a choice. We can stand together and demand the respect we deserve. More workers began to join the growing coalition, their voices adding to a chorus of defiance that echoed through the factory. Morrison looked around desperately, realizing that his authority was crumbling before his eyes. His wealth and connections meant nothing if his workforce united against him. "Aldrich," Morrison barked to his foreman, "get the police down here immediately. I want these troublemakers arrested for trespassing and inciting violence." But Aldrich hesitated, recognizing that calling the police could escalate the situation beyond control. "Sir, perhaps we should try to negotiate. These men have legitimate grievances, and if we could address some of their concerns..." Morrison whirled on his foreman with fury. "Negotiate? With common laborers? I don't negotiate with employees, Aldrich. I give orders, and they follow them. That's how business works." Thomas seized on Morrison's intransigence as an opportunity to solidify worker support. "You hear that? Mr. Morrison won't even consider listening to our concerns. He sees us as slaves, not human beings with rights and dignity. Is that the kind of man you want controlling your lives?" The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming. Shouts of "no" and "down with Morrison" filled the air as years of suppressed anger finally found expression. Workers who had never dared to speak above a whisper in Morrison's presence were now openly defying his authority. The standoff continued through the afternoon as word of the confrontation spread beyond the factory walls. Workers from other industrial sites in Pittsburgh began to arrive, drawn by rumors of an unprecedented challenge to one of the city's most powerful railroad barons. The crowd outside the Pennsylvania Steel Railway Company grew larger and more vocal, transforming what had begun as a workplace accident into a symbol of labor resistance. Inside the factory, Morrison found himself increasingly isolated. His attempts to intimidate individual workers had failed, and his threats of mass firings had only strengthened their resolve. For the first time in his career, he faced opposition he couldn't buy, bully, or manipulate into submission. Thomas organized the workers into groups, assigning responsibilities and ensuring that essential safety functions continued even as the confrontation escalated. His mechanical knowledge and natural leadership abilities had earned him respect that transcended the traditional hierarchy of industrial labor. Workers who had never spoken to each other before found themselves united by a common cause. "We need to document every safety violation, every workplace injury, every instance of unfair treatment," Thomas announced to the assembled crowd. "Mr. Morrison thinks he can operate above the law, but there are labor regulations in Pennsylvania that even railroad barons must follow." Morrison overheard this strategy and realized the true threat Thomas represented. A simple work stoppage could be broken with replacement workers and police intervention, but a coordinated effort to expose safety violations and labor law violations could bring government scrutiny that even his considerable influence might not deflect. As evening approached, word arrived from the hospital where Patrick O'Brien was receiving treatment. The doctor had managed to save his leg, though he would walk with a permanent limp and never return to factory work. The news brought cheers from the workers and a moment of satisfaction for Thomas, who had risked everything to ensure his colleague received proper medical care. Morrison seized on this positive development as an opportunity to regain control. "You see, the man received medical treatment. The system worked exactly as it should. Now it's time for all of you to return to your duties before this situation gets completely out of hand." But Thomas wasn't finished. He had spent the day listening to stories from his fellow workers, cataloguing years of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. The injury to Patrick O'Brien was just the latest in a long pattern of preventable accidents caused by Morrison's cost-cutting measures. "The system didn't work, Mr. Morrison," Thomas replied firmly. "A good man nearly died because you refused to maintain safe equipment. How many more accidents will happen before you take responsibility for the conditions in this factory?" Morrison's patience had reached its limit. He turned to Aldrich with a final ultimatum. "I want the police here within the hour. Anyone who refuses to disperse will be arrested for unlawful assembly and destruction of company property. I've had enough of this nonsense." But as Morrison prepared for a final confrontation, an unexpected visitor arrived at the factory. Mayor William Blackwood of Pittsburgh, accompanied by several city councilmen and a reporter from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, entered the facility to assess the situation firsthand. Word of the labor dispute had reached the highest levels of city government, and political leaders were concerned about the potential for violence. Mayor Blackwood was a practical politician who understood that labor unrest could damage Pittsburgh's reputation as a center of industrial progress. He also recognized that Morrison's wealth and influence made him a powerful ally, but public opinion was beginning to shift in favor of worker rights. "Gentlemen," the mayor announced to the crowd, "I'm here to ensure that this dispute is resolved peacefully and fairly. Mr. Morrison, these workers have raised serious concerns about safety conditions in your factory. Perhaps it would be appropriate to address their grievances through proper channels." Morrison felt cornered by the political pressure, but remained defiant. "Mayor Blackwood, these men are trespassing on private property and disrupting lawful business operations. I demand that you order them to disperse immediately." Thomas stepped forward to address the mayor directly. "Your Honor, we're not asking for special treatment. We simply want safe working conditions, fair wages, and basic human dignity. Mr. Morrison has ignored our concerns for years, and it took a near-fatal accident to get his attention." The mayor looked around the factory, noting the obviously dangerous equipment and poor working conditions that were visible even to his untrained eye. The political calculation was clear. Supporting Morrison's position could make him appear callous to working-class voters who formed a significant portion of his constituency. "Mr. Morrison," the mayor said carefully, "I suggest you work with these men to address their legitimate safety concerns. Pittsburgh's industrial reputation depends on maintaining good relations between management and labor." Morrison realized that his political support was crumbling along with his authority over the workers. The presence of the press meant that his response would be scrutinized by the public, and any heavy-handed tactics could backfire spectacularly. After a long moment of tense silence, Morrison finally spoke. "Fine, I'll establish a committee to review safety procedures and consider worker recommendations. But I want it understood that I'm doing this voluntarily, not because I'm yielding to pressure from malcontents and troublemakers." Thomas felt a surge of victory, but he also understood that this was just the beginning of a longer struggle. Morrison's grudging concession was motivated by political necessity rather than genuine concern for worker welfare, and vigilance would be required to ensure that promises were kept. As the crowd began to disperse and normal operations slowly resumed, Thomas found himself fundamentally changed by the day's events. He had discovered that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power when they stood together for justice. The rebellion that had begun with a workplace accident had evolved into something much larger. Proof that even the most powerful tyrants could be challenged by those who refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Morrison retreated to his office, his fury undiminished but his options limited. He had underestimated the courage of his workers and the power of unified resistance. The industrial age was changing, and men like Thomas McKenna represented a new generation of laborers who would no longer accept exploitation as the price of employment. The Pennsylvania Steel Railway Company would never be the same.